Okay, so the catalog is only Appendix A. So it's just this little thing that we attach to the back of the framework report. I appreciate everyone saying that RTI did this, and we certainly had a leadership role in this, but we could not have done it alone. This whole thing has been informed since the very beginning by a great group of experts and consultants, but also by the steering committee. I mean, during the regular meetings of the steering committee, we came back to the steering committee, presented what we were doing, but it wasn't just an update, it was a conversation and a lot of great input from a lot of different people in a lot of different areas. And that's what made this really what it is today, which is hopefully reflects all of the input that we've gotten from across the board. So the objective of the catalog was really to provide an overview of the range of methods. It is not meant to be a systematic review. It is meant to take a look at what has been used out there and what could potentially be used out there to incorporate patient preferences into benefit-risk decisions. It is meant to be a resource, and in particular a starting point, where you can kind of get an overview of the range of what is out there. We've tried to put some categorization around it, which turned out to be a little bit harder than we thought it would be, but at least it provides a framework for beginning to see what's out there that comes from different literatures and different disciplines that could potentially be used here. So it is a place to start, and we've tried to set it up in a way, so, and I'll show some slides on that later, in a way where you can kind of go and get your feet wet more than anything else and try to put it into context. So it provides an introduction. This is not a how-to guide. This is not an algorithmic approach to how you actually choose one, nor how you actually implement one, but it's meant to be an overview and an introduction. It is, as I mentioned, it's not a systematic review. It's not a guide to determining which one is right in which situation. We provide some outline to that in terms of what different types of information you can get from each one of these, and in other parts of the framework, we talk about what types of information may be necessary, and then you have to build the pieces together. So this is a reference document, not a cookbook. And we also don't go very deep into exactly how each method needs to be implemented. We've tried to provide a lot of empirical references and guidance as to where you can go to find more information, but this is not a textbook. It may not be the best bedtime reading, but it is also not a textbook. But to get started on this, we had to start somewhere. And where we started with what is a working definition of patient preference methods, we've called it a working definition throughout because it has kind of evolved as we've gone through this process. And it probably still is, in a sense, a work in process. We could refine this in lots of different ways, but this outlines some key components that we were kind of looking for in trying to assembling all of these things. So first, it is a way that you can collect and analyze data, and we were really looking at quantitative assessments here. We could have included qualitative as well, but we were really looking at, for that evidence that is provided for regulatory decision-making, what quantitative methods are out there where we can look at the goods and the bads, both the desirability and the acceptability, and in particular of the attributes that differ, because that's where the real challenge is. If you're comparing something against standard of care or against another device, what has changed? Where are the incremental benefits and where are the incremental risks? I think Bennett's going to talk more about this definition later this morning. So then we had to figure out, okay, what do we include, what do we not include, where do we go for this stuff? So we identified some principles, and they started out as criteria, but then we realized that criteria wasn't quite the right way to go because not everything fit every criterion. So we decided to make these into guiding principles. First of all, we should be able to get the relative importance of benefits and risks. We decided to limit it to those things that had been published in peer-reviewed literature so that there was some history and track record there. Things that have been applied to health. So there may be lots of preference methods out there that have not previously been applied to health that could be used here. They're not included in the catalog. And we wanted them to be anything that was published in health that could be used to elicit patient preferences, even if it had not been used for patients per se in the past. We wanted to include that because we didn't want to exclude things just because, well, we've looked at physicians' preferences or decision-making, but not patients. We didn't want to exclude those if they could be potentially relevant. So in the end, we started with a long list. It changed over the course of the project based on how these principles and criteria developed, and in the end, it really was a consensus as to which ones should be in and which ones should not be in. So this is the list of the methods that are included, and the way we have categorized them in large measure is in which literature do these show up. All right, so there's a whole group of structured weighting methods that show up in the decision analytic literature. There's a whole literature on health state utilities out there. There's a stated preference literature out there that spans a number of different types of methods, and there are some things that are used in structured weighting that we could consider stated preferences. So, you know, this categorization is not perfect, but it provides a way of thinking about it. And then there is this revealed preference literature out there, which was relatively new to me, that turned out to be pretty interesting, including patient preference or preference cohort trials and the like. So this was our way of thinking about it, and we think it makes sense and logically makes sense to kind of categorize these things this way. We note throughout the catalog that certain methods are used in multiple literatures, and we acknowledge it as such. Okay. We excluded certain methods from the catalog. The first one was qualitative methods. We have a section in the catalog that describes the potential role of qualitative methods, acknowledges that there's a lot of qualitative work out there. There's qualitative work out there that actually gives you quantitative results. But we didn't spend our time looking at that literature because we were really trying to hone in on what can give us the qualitative or the quantitative stuff that could be used to provide evidence in regulatory decision-making. We didn't include patient-reported outcomes, and that decision was revisited a number of times in steering committee meetings because really patient-reported outcomes are not preference measures. They provide input from the patient on endpoints and outcomes, and they may measure things like satisfaction, often falls into the patient-reported outcomes literature, but preferences, generally speaking, are something very different and in a literature separate from the PRO literature. We did not explicitly include multi-criteria decision methods, and the reason I raise that specifically is there is a lot of use or advocacy for use of multi-criteria decision analysis and multi-criteria decision methods in benefit risk analysis, particularly if you look at the IMI Protect work that's been done in Europe. And those methods are decision methods, and they have a role, but they're not in and of themselves patient preference methods. What we really focused in on was what part of those methods are used to incorporate the preferences or to get the weights. So there is a subset of tasks within a multi-criteria decision method that is truly a preference method. We didn't go into explaining the entire method. We really zeroed in on what the potential methods are to elicit patient preferences. So the review of methods, once we've identified these things, we then review each of the methods and each of the categories of methods. So first we provide a top-level description. Then we organize the review around a set of questions. And the questions relate to the methodology, the sample, the analysis, and the output. And then in the end, we include a very brief top-level description of how this method may have been applied to the original research question in the weight loss study that FDA did that you'll hear more about today. And that turned out to be a little bit harder than we thought it was going to be. Because there's a lot of extra context that needs to be put in around that we didn't quite have in the catalog. So we've left it at a very top level, but it begins to give you a way to think about it, and then we provide a lot of references of where you can go to learn more. So the methodology-related questions really come down to how are the data acquired, whether you do small groups or you do surveys or you use other methods. Is this a hypothetical scenario or a real-world scenario? How do you actually determine what goes into the study? because conceivably there are lots of benefits and lots of risks and lots of other attributes and features of technologies that you could include in a study, and it is not feasible to elicit preferences over absolutely everything. So you've got to make some judgments. So how do these tend to happen in the different methods? And then is the method experimental or otherwise? Sample-related questions really gave us quite a bit of challenges because there are sample questions related to the method and sample questions related to the implementation. But in some cases, there are minimum sample sizes, and we wanted to identify when those minimums existed. In some cases, while there may not be maximum sample sizes, there really are maximum practical, feasible sample sizes, particularly when you're talking about panel methods or individual interviews or those types of things. There are practical limits on how much you can do. We wanted to address what's the level of time commitment and what's the difficulty involved on the part of the patient, because some of these may be very easy to do with patients, and some may require a little bit more, and you need to take that patient burden into account if you're trying to elicit preferences. Analysis-related questions are really, how hard is this to do? Is it easy to interpret? Is it easy to analyze? Can you describe the analysis easily? Or is it a little bit more complicated? Do you need specialized software? Or is this something where you could just do calculations in a spreadsheet? And potentially most importantly is what are the outputs that you get from these things? And this is reflected really in Section 5 in the framework report, is what are the different types of informations can you get? Can you identify these things? And some of these methods may only be limited to identifying what is important to patients. Can you actually get weights for these things? Can you estimate trade-offs for these things? And as Jeff mentioned before, heterogeneity is really important here. Can this method be used to evaluate or quantify or understand the heterogeneity of preferences within a sample and across a population? There are some general considerations, mostly related to implementation, that we initially had tried to include in the reviews of each of the methods and very quickly realized that, well, it depends on how you use it, and they tend to cross over all methods. So we actually have a section in the report related to general considerations. First, the research question and the study objective influences what you do and how you do it. Then the issues of representativeness and generalizability. You're going to be talking to a subset of patients, or you're going to be getting data from a sample of patients. How generalizable is that? How representative is that? If you want to do subgroup analyses, how do you need to oversample particular groups? For example, in the obesity study, FDA was particularly interested in knowing the experiences and the preferences of people who had had prior interventions for weight loss, so we needed to oversample those people in order to get those data. So those are the questions that you need to consider when designing a study. Heterogeneity, and we had Ken Deal from McMaster University help us out with this one, who was an expert in latent class analysis in particular, but heterogeneity can be subsample heterogeneity, meaning that people with different characteristics have different preferences, but that preferences don't necessarily correspond to individual characteristics or demographics. You and I could have different preferences even if we looked exactly the same on paper. And how do we deal with that? Validity is a big sticking point here. I mean, how do you validate these methods, and what are the standards for validity that are going to be necessary in order for these data to be useful and generally accepted? And then in the end, what are the resource requirements? That includes time, that includes expertise, that includes data collection and financial resources. How could we generalize about what the resource requirements are for different methods? Okay. Then we include a section on examples of prior use. And this one turned out for me personally to be pretty interesting because I got to delve into a lot of literature where I wasn't necessarily very familiar. And what we tried to do is for each of these methods, not only just provide references for applications of the individual methods, but to provide some summaries of some of those particular studies. This was in no way a systematic review. It was looking very specifically at, is there a good example of this particular method to estimate patients' benefit-risk preferences? There are a few reviews that are out there, particularly quite a lot of work that came from IMI Protect, which was in working documents published by IMI before and is now showing up in the literature. We didn't want to replicate what was done there, but we cite those as resources to say, hey, go take a look at these things, because they have a lot more detail on a lot of these case studies than we have in here. So we've tried to build the roadmap for here's what we have, here are some examples, here are places to go for additional information. And in the end, throughout the process of both the working group and the steering committee and all the reviews from MDIC members and from other stakeholders who reviewed different parts of the document at different places along the development, a number of questions arose for which we didn't have good answers. And that lended itself to suggestions for future research. And those questions came about, really could be divided into 4 categories. How do you choose a method? How do you choose the sample for the method? How do you develop the study? And how do you know if the study is valid? So the working group got together, reviewed all of the questions. We had to go back and find documentation to make sure that we tried not to miss anything. And then we came up with these categories and came up with a number of suggestions for future research, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But essentially, one of the big questions that arose was, which is the right method? And there's not necessarily a clear answer to that, but the question for us became, is there if you used different methods, would you come to the same conclusions, or would you generate evidence that would lead to the same conclusion? Where there is a dearth of information is on comparison of methods. There is some work recently that has been ongoing with certain methods, and we acknowledge that in the report, but there are other comparisons that probably need to be done as well. What about the sample? Are these methods particularly sensitive to the sample that you use if you're collecting primary data? There is not a great literature out there, particularly on preference studies, as to whether or not how sensitive different methods are, or whether they are sensitive, one is more sensitive than another. Prior experience, and does it matter? And in some cases in literature it says it does, and in some cases it doesn't. There's more in pharmaceuticals than there is in devices or medical technologies. So one thing that may be good to know is, how much does that experience matter, and does it matter consistently? And then how do you choose attributes? And this is just something with preference work that is often a challenge, is how do you know you have the right attributes? In part, that's determined by the research question, but in part, in all preference research, the question is, what happens if you include one or don't include one? Does it make a difference to the other stuff that's left over if you take some stuff out? And then the issue of validity. There is quite a bit of work out there in terms of, for those where you get repeated responses, those methods that get repeated responses from the same individual, you can look at the consistency of their responses. So there are some measures out there. What is lacking is, what is an acceptable level of consistency? That leads into the question of validity. And validity standards in preference work is kind of like, I know it when I see it, and it makes sense. And I think a lot of people would agree that, yes, this looks valid, but the standards out there are not the same as they are, for example, in patient-reported outcome studies. So dealing with questions of validity in terms of moving forward, so that users have confidence that what has been done is a good study or not, or a valid study or not. So there are a number of suggestions for future research. They're organized around specific questions that I didn't list here, but there are a number of these related specifically to the methods, and then these are folded in again, as Ross mentioned, into suggestions for future research and what happens next within the context of the framework.